This is the story of how people, average citizens, can make things happen for the good of the community. This is about the Butler Freeport Community Trail. It took 20 years of intense efforts to take a basic concept and turn it into a magnificent community asset which is being enjoyed by thousands of people every year. Let's talk with two people who from the very beginning helped make it happen. Meet Ron Bennett, the first president of the Butler Freeport Community Trail Council, and Ouch Roenigk, a Buffalo Township supervisor. Now, Ouch, you were there in the very beginning when you first heard about this whole concept. How did that come about?
Well, Buffalo Township in the spring of '88 got a letter from the DER along with every township in two counties, Butler County and Armstrong County, starts in Freeport. If we was interested, because the first right to refusal, they would hold it 1 year for us. And Buffalo Township was the only one that really responded to that letter. Our board at that time, it was kind of an intriguing. We never heard of rails to trails. I had never heard. I don't think anybody on our board had.
Ouch, what were they asking you to do? What were they asking you to follow?
If we was interested in buying it.
Buying the railroad right away?
The right away.
Okay. And what did they suggest what they wanted you to do with it?
I don't think they really cared if we weren't interested in buying it. If nobody was interested in buying it, they had private investors that were wanting to buy sections of it. I know one would be a rail line up to where the Rex Mix thing is above Lernerville. Mm-hmm. And anyway, we responded.
When you first heard of the idea, when you first saw the letter as a township supervisor, were you immediately interested?
It seemed like it was kind of intriguing to us, because I don't think we really knew that the railroad was going to discontinue service on there, but most of us knew of the railroad or had walked part of it, not myself so much, but a lot of the older people in the township walked from Sarver to Cabot or along the railroad.
And at that time you weren't one of the older people, were you?
No, I wasn't one then. I am not.
Now, were the other supervisors as interested as you were?
I think Cecil Fuhrer was really interested, Terry Bergbigler, Herman Stepling, and at that time, Lowell Thompson.
Yeah.
When you got that letter and you saw that the Department of Environmental Resources of Pennsylvania wanted you to take over the soon-to-be abandoned railroad line, what did you think you could do with it?
Well, at one time, it was for a recreation trail, but there was people, even I think it was one or two on our board thought, well, we bought the whole railroad and we could run a little excursion train. But when you find out the millions of dollars that costs just to maintain it and the liability, it wasn't too feasible.
And about that time, that's when Buffalo Township resident Ernie Braggle came on the scene and started talking to the township about the rails to trails concept, which was relatively new in the nation and very new in Pennsylvania. So he's the one that sort of perked their interest in saying, hey, this can become a hiking and biking trail at that point.
So Ron, you had heard about biking trails and hiking trails being put on railroad property before?
Yeah, I knew a little bit about it. I did a lot of bicycling at the time on the roads. And like I said, I was reading the Butler Eagle one day, and there was this tiny little one-paragraph article about Buffalo Township looking at converting an old rail line into a hiking and biking trail. And I thought it was interesting. And so I had my wife take me down to Cabot one Sunday and drop me off, and I told her to meet me an hour or two later down in Sarver, and I walked down the trail and fell in love with it.
What did the trail look like? What was it physically like at that point, just before the railroad abandoned it and before any work was done to make it into a real trail?
If I remember right, I think the tracks were still in place at that time. They hadn't pulled those up yet. But it was just such a scenic walk that I just said, I got to see if I can get involved in this. And I went to a Buffalo Township meeting and met Ouch for the first time. And I basically said, what can I do to help make this happen? And then Ouch said, well, show that there's public support for it.
Were there any other residents at the meeting who gave some thoughts about what they thought about it?
I'm pretty sure Ernie was there. I can't remember. This is going back years. But at that point, it was just something that the Township Board of Supervisors were discussing. There wasn't a lot of public input into it at that point because it was just, township meetings aren't that exciting. People don't go to them that often.
Ron, did you think it was going to be an easy job just to make this rail line into a walking, biking trail?
No. And in hindsight, I realized I had no idea how hard it would be. But I thought it was worth it. It was worth pursuing, at least at that point.
Ouch, was there township money involved here?
Not at that time, there wasn't. Until we got a grant. This goes clean up to 94, a grant to do the first 12 miles of that trail.
When was the starting date of this whole point, the day you got that letter from the Department of Environmental Resources?
It was in the spring of '88.
1988, and nothing really happened until some years later then.
Well, it took us 3 years. We got till 1990. They extended that right to refusal. They held it for us. In the meantime, Conrail wanted to take the rails. I think the price of scrap had something to do with it. They were selling the rails and the ties, but they couldn't just let a contractor come in there and take them off on Conrail's property. So this name of the company was B-Sykes Limited, and they sold it to them, but the DER wouldn't allow them to sell it to them unless they had an agreement with Buffalo Township.
Because you had the first right of refusal.
Yeah, right. That we would, as soon as they were done, we would buy it off them.
Ouch, did you have any idea what the next years would be like getting this thing together?
Not really.
But looking back on it, would you have rejected the idea, knowing what you had to go through?
I don't think. There was a couple things I'm thinking, what were we thinking? The one you asked about money, I know Township Secretary and I we got prices, because when they did it, it was a grant, but you had to pay up front. The contractors weren't paid, every so often. And we went to Mars Bank and borrowed $250,000 in Buffalo Township's name to pay. We got all our money back, but I'm thinking, if we tried to do that now, I don't know if it would work.
Well, let's go back to then. Did some of the residents complain that you were using their tax money for reasons that they weren't happy with?
Not really. We weren't really using their tax money. We borrowed the money, real low interest, and I suppose we paid, but we got that all back. See, these programs are the PennDOT administers these programs. District 10 in Indiana, it's 7 counties, I think. Indiana, Armstrong, Butler, Beaver, Lawrence, probably another. But anyway, it's the first they ever got involved in rails to trails or any of these, rails to trails or rail banking. They were as dumb as we were about it.
But you really seem to love the idea. You just took this thing and ran with it, didn't you?
Yeah, I wasn't the only one, but I was really interested in it. And a lot of the older people, they thought it was a good idea. But I don't think any of them still living now. But at that time, even my father, and he wasn't a railroader. He was a farmer, but he knew the railroad, and he thought that was a good idea.
Had anybody in the area ever seen one of these kind of places operating? Are there any rails to trails operations anywhere in western Pennsylvania?
Well, Ron would know more about that, where they started, but not in Butler, not in District 10. All of them, I think it's 7 counties.
I was the first in Butler County and the District 10 PennDOT area. We were right on the cutting edge of when this first started.
By that time, in the very beginning, when you first got interested, you liked the idea immediately. You were a bike rider and a hiker. Did you know of any operating places around western Pennsylvania?
Not really, no.
So you never saw a model?
I went into sort of blind, yeah.
You never saw a model for what you were going to do?
Well, maybe Ohio Power might have been up and running at that time. But as far as the rail banking concept, that was relatively new.
And tell me what that means, rail banking.
Basically what it is, the United States invested millions of dollars through the railroad companies over the years, granting the easements and right-of-ways to the railroad companies. And in the probably from 1970s on, railroads with the advent of modern trucking and the interstate system, the railroads were in a decline financially and physically, a lot of problems with the rails and things like that. And being a business, they needed to be profitable. So a lot of the profits were diverted from maintaining old rail lines that were hardly ever used or very rarely used. And that was a way for them to recoup some money and retain, maintain being a profitable company. So the government saw that a lot of these lines were being abandoned and just left to, revert back to adjacent landowners. And when they started looking if they ever had to put railroads back in place again, the cost would be absorbent. They had already, the money had already been invested in securing these lines and these right-of-ways, and they thought, why are we letting this happen? So that became the National Rails to Trails Act as a way to preserve these corridors for future transportation use. The intent is it can be a hiking and biking trail or a scenic railroad or something like that under the act, but the main primary focus was if the government ever needed those railroad lines back, that there was a way to get them reestablished at very minimal cost.
So this is rail banking. In other words, it's a way to keep that right-of-way available for some time in the future when there might be more railroads coming back.
PennDOT says we have no money to maintain Interstate 79, but we might want to use it in the future. So they put up barricades at each end and say we're abandoning it, and all the landowners come in and take the property. Now, if PennDOT wants to come back and rebuild 79, it's going to cost them a fortune. So it's the same concept. It was a transportation corridor. The federal government wanted to preserve those in the event of national crisis where, we run out of gasoline and they need to use the trains again to move produce and people. It was just a security thing in the long term.
Ron, you said earlier that hundreds of people signed up they liked the idea, they signed petitions. Did they really know what it was all about?
Yeah, basically it wasn't so much a petition as a flyer that I made up and printed and I handed it out at soccer games, baseball games, community events, it just described the project, the concept of it, what we were trying to do, what it could become, what it meant to the community, and ask them to just put their name and address at the bottom of the sheet and mail it in. And then over the course of the one summer, we probably had over 700 signatures, and this was before the internet, and everything was just by word of mouth, and someone would say, I like this idea, give me, and they'd make copies, and they'd have their friends sign it and send it in.
During this whole time, Ouch, were there many people coming to the township officially objecting to the idea?
Not at that time. I'm not saying there weren't any, but most people thought it was a good idea. One of the things, people rode bicycles on roads. They rode them on 356. They still do, but limited amount. But it's not safe. It's not even safe to walk along a road like that.
But those railroads were going through near private property. Did some of those property owners along the way of this future trail object?
Later, when an attorney came along and told them it reverted back to them.
Now, they thought when the railroad abandoned it, it automatically went back to the original landowners way back in the 1800s?
But our court ruling was, at the end, it never was abandoned.
Yeah, a number of the early opposition, when we sat down with them on one-to-one discussions with them and talked about what it really was like, what it was going to be like, then they sort of came around. Not all of them, but a number of them did. And I think what happened once the tracks were taken up, I remember going on a walk one day and a pickup truck came down the trail and the guys were jumping out and grabbing scrap steel that had been left by the salvage company, cutting off the metal railings of the bridges, and people were down there partying because they knew no one was going to be down there because no one knew who was in charge of it at the time. So there was probably more complaints about that conduct and atmosphere than they were about the potential use as a trail.
Physically, when you said you first heard of the concept, you walked along some portion of it. What did it look like? What was the ground like? What was the condition of the walking surface?
I'm pretty sure when I was there, the tracks were still there and the ballast and the ties. So basically, we're walking along the edge of the rail bed. I remember probably a year later, after the tracks had been removed and the ties had been removed, Ernie Braggo and myself and another young guy took a bike ride from Freeport all the way to Butler, and we rode on the ballast. The tracks had been removed, the ties had been removed, but the big stone ballast was still there. And so we rode pretty much 20 miles on a really rough surface. It was the hardest bike ride I ever had in my life.
You said ballast. What's ballast?
It's the big limestone chips, stones, basically.
Well,
that supports the tracks.
When it came time to actually making the trail, I know there were some bridges involved, and also you had to do something with the surface. What did you do with all that ballast, and what did you do with all the rails?
Well, Ouch can probably answer more on the ballast because
The townships, Jefferson and Winfield and Buffalo, together they took the ballast off. Buffalo didn't have the need. Most of our roads were paved at the time, but Jefferson and Winfield had a lot of roads that needed the ballast. So they got thousands of tons of ballast off there, and we did too.
Did each of the townships put guarantee money against this whole project?
Yeah, when we ended up buying it, it was 3 townships: Winfield, Jefferson, and Buffalo. And
the other townships didn't want to go along with it?
well, at one time, Summit was interested, but then, for whatever reason, politics change.
Yeah.
Everybody doesn't stay in the same job 40 years. So.
Now there were some physical problems. The ballast had to be taken away, and that was sold off. And apparently the townships benefited because they didn't have to buy it themselves for whatever they used ballast for. But what about the bridges? I guess that could have been a problem.
Well, that's when we had formed the Trail Council about that time, and it was eventually became a nonprofit 501c. But at that time, it was just a loosely established organization of a number of guys and some ladies, and we basically went down and on the bridges fabricated womanized wood railings and metal brackets to attach to the concrete, and basically we just wanted to make them safe that people could use the trail. And as far as the surface, the townships, when they come in and taking the ballast off, there's always a lot of fine material left that works its way down over the years through the ballast. So they basically just graded that off, made it nice and smooth, and I'm not even sure if they even rolled it. I think they just graded it off, and it was suitable for riding bikes and walking. It was a nice, soft surface.
What about the bridges? Wasn't that a problem?
No, because the bridges were made so that the railroad ballast net was built on top of it. So once the ballast was removed, it was basically a flat concrete deck to go across.
I thought I heard somewhere, maybe you told me this earlier, that some of the bridges had to be raised up to a certain level, and that
The one at Herman.
and that Ouch could have been a really expensive project. Tell us about that.
Well, Ron could probably tell it better, but it was PennDOT. Summit Township wanted to take it down, which the trail would have just ended. I guess you could have went around it, but you'd been back on the road. But anyway, it had to be raised 2 feet to 14-foot height.
Is that for some new standards, or?
Yeah, that's the new standards.
Okay.
Of all, whether it's power lines or whatever.
So how do you go about raising a bridge 2 feet?
Oh, we worked with a local contractor, and they volunteered some time, and then we paid them for some of the days. But we had a crew go up, and over the course of probably 5 days, we took the old railroad ties off the bridge because they were still on it, the old wooden ties. They jacked the bridge up. We had to control traffic underneath for this, public safety, and jacked it up, poured new concrete pedestals, and then set the bridge back down on it, and then put metal decking down on the deck and poured concrete surface to ride on and walk on, and welded. I think Ouch came up and helped weld metal brackets on the side for the railings.
Well, that sounds too simple, and it sounds too different from the way things are today. Didn't the state have to have some kind of a special survey taken and all that kind of stuff?
Well, they had estimated that it would cost about $200,000 to $300,000 to do the work, and we did it for. We had a little bit of a grant and some money. We did it for probably 25, something like that.
Instead of 300,000.
Yes.
How did they come up with the 300,000?
Just based on the length of the bridge and just what it costs to do construction. And of course, in our case, there was no profit built into it.
Well, the way things are today, you have to have architects, you have to have special experts, you have to have all these other kind of people involved. You got through with all that.
Yeah, I mean, worked with PennDOT. They knew what we were doing and notified them of the traffic restrictions and things. And the fact that we had a PennDOT certified contractor pretty much doing the dangerous work of jacking up the bridge.
How did you avoid all the red tape?
Well, there again, it was sort of a new concept. PennDOT said, we said are the restrictions that we can't go in and do that as a private organization with the township's consent, and they agreed that there was nothing saying that you couldn't do it.
Legal action started before too long, where the people who were really opposed to it decide to go to the courts. Would you tell us about when that started and how it started?
Well, that started after we
Had the first section done.
got the grant to do the first 12 miles from
the trail
Bonnie Brook Road to Bear Creek Road or Monroe Road.
The section from Cabot to Sarver had been open for 2 or 3 years prior to that, while we were trying to get financing and get this grant.
So that was the sampling, wasn't it? That first short stretch?
Right, yeah.
And was that made, redone and resurfaced the way?
Eventually, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But the railings are still here that we
So
built.
that was your model for the whole project?
Originally, we did from Sarver to Cabot and just smoothed up what was there after the bells was off. And we had a grand opening. We got pictures. We had Franco Harris there with the kids riding bicycles, and the Della Cruz from Channel 11. She was there.
Your dad there, his horses.
My dad had his horses. He'd go up and take a load of.
What year was that? When that first leg opened up?
91, I believe.
Probably 91.
Yeah.
The whole thing started in 1988, so the first leg was 1991. And at that point, had you had much residential resistance?
No, just like I said, the few we had mentioned earlier, that once we talked to them, they understood what we were actually trying to do. And when the township started keeping people off it that weren't supposed to be there, like people riding down there in trucks and motorcycles and that, once the people saw that the township was going to enforce the rules, and a lot of the opposition quieted down at that point. But
Were there some specified entry points to get into the trail at that point, or did they go anywhere along the way?
Just Cabot and Starboard were the 2 points, yeah.
That's the only places they could get in, not along the trailway itself?
Well, yeah, there was nothing to stop them from coming from the adjacent property, yeah. But, the real opposition started, like Al said, after we got that grant and started the construction. And an attorney from Pittsburgh that was a property rights advocate called me and asked, who owns this property? He wanted to go fishing along it, blah, blah. And next thing we know, he's, rounding up people, having meetings, stirring up opposition to the trail, and trying to get people to do a class action lawsuit against the trail.
So he gave you the impression that he was just an individual wanting to fish
Yes.
along the trail.
Mm-hmm.
Did you suspect that?
When he started asking about who owned the property and how did they acquire it, I knew something was up, yeah.
And now, so what was the first lawsuit?
I think they went to court seeking an injunction to keep the township off of the trail, claiming that it was theirs, and with numerous meetings with the attorneys.
These were the adjacent property owners that were suing?
Yes, this attorney was representing them. And, in subsequent meetings with the township attorneys and their insurance company attorneys and that, it was decided that they had a quitclaim deed that was in their name, that really the proof of ownership really they had to prove that we didn't own it. So basically they went in and the township sought an injunction against them and basically forced them to show that they had a right to it because the township had a deed recorded at the courthouse saying that they owned the right of way.
Ouch, did the legal expenses start building up pretty heavily?
Well, I want to go back a little bit to the rail banking thing. We had applied, Conrail made us an offer. They would go to DC, to the ICC, to rail bank that for Buffalo Township. And they went, and it missed by one vote. And I don't know if the attorney from Pittsburgh was involved in that or not. At that time, we didn't even know who he was. But our attorney at the time, John Morgan from Butler, he was our Buffalo Township solicitor. He said, you don't have to go, because the ICC we could have went back. But Conrail said it'll cost you $50,000 because we got to pay our attorneys, and our solicitor, John Morgan, said, you don't have to go to the ICC to do it. Nowhere in that law does it say that you have to go to Washington, D.C. to rail bank this. You just put it in your deed that it's rail banked. And at that time, Senator Stuart Greenleaf from Pennsylvania was doing the Pennsylvania Rail Banking Law Act 620.
Senate Bill 620.
Yeah, Senate Bill 620. And that was in 1990, so we attached onto that. He sent us a letter that we might have been the first one that was on that rail bank under the Pennsylvania rail banking law.
But there are others then that were starting to get involved too, so you weren't so alone as you were before.
Right. Armstrong County was getting involved in the corridor along Allegheny River, and there are numerous other ones, but we sort of led the way on some of that.
Yeah, and it ended up when, to go jump way ahead, when we actually won in Butler County and Allegheny, or Common Pleas, Commonwealth Court, the state Supreme Court, and then the federal Supreme Court. Well, they didn't hear the case, but by that they kind of affirmed it. It set a precedent that you didn't have to go through the ICC to rail banking. So probably the Armstrong Trail wouldn't be there, because they had a lot of opposition.
So it was never really acted on by the state Supreme Court?
No, the state Supreme Court ruled in our favor. Yeah.
Okay.
And then they took
They
it.
affirmed the lower courts, I guess.
Right.
Is that what they were doing?
Then the people that were against it sent it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they refused to hear it. They said that,
How long did all this legal action take? How many years was that?
10 years?
Probably 10 years.
At least 10 years.
10 years?
Yeah.
Wasn't that expensive?
somewhat we had a lot, our insurance paid some of it until the attorney, he not only sued Ron Bennett and his group, he sued our attorney, John Morgan. So then we had to get another attorney to
defend your attorney.
Yeah, right. And it started costing money, but the insurance company, he sued us for violating their civil rights. Well, our insurance company then wrote, they won't defend us if we violate. We didn't violate anybody's civil rights. He just said we did.
When all of these lawsuits were taking place, going as high as almost the Supreme Court, and there was a lot of publicity, the newspapers, the radio, probably television out of Pittsburgh, what did the public say about all this? What did residents in Buffalo Township and some other areas have to say about all this? Were they interested?
Yeah, there was still a lot of support. A lot of people were still using the trail in the sections that had been opened at that time. I think once people were using it and saw what it was like, they sort of became on our side, that they said it was a great community asset, that it was worth fighting for. I don't remember too many township meetings where people were, really upset about the townships proceeding to fight for it. Once it got established and people were using it. Yeah.
Did you have to wait until all the Supreme Court decisions were handed down, the Superior Court in Pennsylvania, and maybe the rejection from the federal Supreme, in order to continue the process of building the entire trail?
No, because Butler County Court had granted them a permanent injunction telling the landowners that they weren't allowed to block the trail or impede with anyone using the trail.
Were they doing that?
At some point during the construction, they were, yeah.
What were they doing? What did it look like?
They would put up barricades and signs and
they put
nails on the trail.
Ugly barricades.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Barbed wire strung in old fence.
But the local courts stopped that, is that right?
Right, yeah. They granted a permanent injunction that they weren't allowed to interfere with the trail. So at that point, we were still doing construction, still improving the trail, putting up signs.
Right. 1988 is when all of this started, when you got that letter from the Department of Environmental Resources of Pennsylvania asking you if you wanted to take over that property. When was the entire trail finished? After all the court action was done?
3 years ago?
Probably 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
We did the bridge in the for the Marinara Park in Butler. That's
2017, something like that, 2018?
Probably 16, I'm guessing.
16 or...
Yeah.
And not only Ron's group, but the people who's involved now. You said, where do you get the engineers and stuff? It's hard to believe when the volunteers, they're doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs, engineers, whatever. There's people involved in it and if you try to get volunteers for most things you want to do, you have a hard time getting volunteers. For some reason, they don't have, I mean, people are more interested in volunteer for this, the rails, the trails, or on the trail.
They really believed in it, didn't they? They really bought the whole concept, didn't they?
Well, I've been a supervisor for 40 years, so it's a 6-year term, so I've ran, I don't know how many times I ran, but the one time a businessman in Jefferson Township sent a letter out how much I was costing them. He had somebody running against me, and it was like a couple people said, well, don't mention the trail. Well, I did. I mean, I really mentioned the trail.
This sounds like national politics.
It does.
But the fact is that you won re-election after all of this, what might have been a controversy, means that most of the people apparently were in favor.
Yeah, probably 4 or 5 times I've, won.
What did you have to do after you got the final permission to go ahead and extend the trail for as long as it from Butler to Freeport? Physically, what did you have to do to make that into a trail?
Well, basically, at that point, like I said, all the ballots had been removed. So once the funding was obtained, and there's a number of grants that the trail has gotten over the years, Obviously most from PennDOT and the federal government. It was the contractors that come in, improve the drainage pipes along the trail if they needed fixed, grade the surface, put down a 4-inch or 6-inch surface of crushed limestone, compact it, grade it and compact it, put up signs where needed. Most of the bridge work was done by the volunteer groups. I don't remember other than the bridge up in the Butler area, but there really weren't too many big bridges like that. But basically that was it. It's a simple process. The hardest part is getting the trucks in and out because they had to come in one way or had to back up and drop their load as they were moving down the thing. That was the biggest complaint, was the truck drivers had to back up multiple miles sometimes.
Now, all of this is pretty expensive. You said something earlier about getting grants from different organizations or governments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the first big grant we got was called the ICE-T. It was the Intermodal Surface Transportation Enhancement Act, and it was a lot of the money was earmarked for trail projects and to give people a safe place to ride bicycles without being out on the road. And that was the first grant we got. It was like $190,000, something like that, I'm thinking.
Were you surprised when those grants came through?
I was very happy, yeah. I wasn't surprised because at that time it was starting to get a lot of momentum as the Rails to Trails project. So.
Ouch, did the grants have to go through your township or the group of townships, or do they go through the nonprofit organization, the council?
Well, I guess it'd be in Buffalo Township's name, yeah. There's grants still, Chris Ziegler, and she's really active. She took over for Ron, and kind of it just
moved it to the next
moving.
level.
Yeah. And she gets grants, and there's a lot of small grants she gets that are just aimed towards trail groups.
Well, Chris, from what I understand, Chris Ziegler really devotes herself to this project, doesn't she?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Spends a lot of time on it.
Yes, she does.
Yeah.
She's been on the radio, been interviewed in the newspaper.
Yeah, it took me a long time to convince her to take over because I'd been president probably 17 years, and that's a long time to be in charge of something. So I finally convinced her to take it over, and I said, "You'll enjoy it, it'll be fun." And she's made a career of it because now she's executive director of the Allegheny Valley Land Trust, which is in charge of the Armstrong Trail. So it's her day-to-day job is in being involved with trails, and then she still volunteers as president of the Butler Freeport Trail Council.
Are there many other trails like this now around western Pennsylvania?
More than I could count. Yeah. We're still hard to believe we're still the only one in Butler County, but there's trails all over the state.
Now, I had heard that a long time ago when this was first developing that somehow you'd be connected with the Allegheny Trail?
Yeah, there's numerous plans, and it's, like I said, anything with government, it takes a long time. There's a trail they're trying to, well, obviously there's a trail, the Great Allegheny Passage, they call it, runs from Pittsburgh to Cumberland, Maryland, and then on it to DC. And that's probably one of the premier trails in the country. And then there's another trail that they're trying to establish from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. And part of our trail would be part of that.
Well, this would be a link in that trail.
Right, a link in that trail. There's also, they're trying to get a trail from Pittsburgh to Erie, basically going up along the Allegheny River. And we would be a sort of an offshoot of that going up to Butler from there. So there's big conceptual plans for these trails. It just takes time and money, and that's the delay in it, yeah.
How many people use the Butler Freeport Trail in a year's time? Do you know?
Chris has, she just got counters she's putting on for bicycles. I don't know if a bicycle goes over, it's
supposed to records bikers and walkers, yeah, as one person. We did just a survey one Sunday years ago. We just had people at both ends of the trail just conducting a survey. Like, have you been here before? How often do you come here if you have? Where do you come from? And this was a number of years ago, and we had people from probably probably 10 different counties just on any given Sunday. And I would say we're probably between 50 to 100,000 people a year use the trail.
When somebody comes here from another county, where do they park their car? Are there spaces around the area?
Yeah, anywhere the trail crosses the roads, the public roads, there's usually a parking area. There's a couple larger ones, but most areas there's enough for 10 to 15 cars at most intersections.
And then up in Cabot, when we bought this right away, we didn't, at the time we didn't know, but at Cabot there was a train station there at one time, so there was 1 acre of land came with it, and a businessman from Peters Heating, he got involved, and he helped build that parking lot. His business is real close to it. He sold some, with the Trail Council and the township's permission, he sold some ads on a billboard, but it was like volunteer. A lot of work was put into this.
Did it surprise you, Ouch, that people came out of nowhere, out of the woodwork, literally, to volunteer and do things that you thought you had to pay for or thought you have to buy experience from? Did that surprise you to see that outpouring of interest?
It made me feel good. I don't know. Things like that don't surprise me because there's more good people than bad people anymore. You know, you don't realize it until, it doesn't matter what you're involved in. You know, whether it's cancer or whatever, people do get involved, and there's a lot of people out there that want to be involved.
When the legal stuff was all over that we talked about several times already today, when finally whatever the final decision was, where there was no more legal action possible, did you get any comments at all from those who were opposed to it? Did anybody say, "Okay, we give up," or "You were right," or something like that?
Not comments, but I think they finally realized that their concept of what the rail banking was wrong. I think they came to accept it. I know there was one couple that was one of the driving forces behind the lawsuits that they recently sold their house and they advertised it as close to the trail. They used it as a selling point to sell their house. So yeah, I think a lot of people came around once they saw it and saw the type of people using it. I mean, it's, elderly people, it's runners, hikers, bird watchers, young families. That's what thrills me when I go out and see a young family, a little kid learning how to ride his bike on the trail where it's safe. My son's getting married, and him and his fiance took their engagement pictures on the trail, which made me feel good. So yeah, it's when you go back and see the people using it, and we have the half marathon on the trail, and there's one number of people that had health issues, and they went out and they used the trail for training to run the half marathon, and it changed their life and how their lifestyle has become much better because of it. So yeah, it's all worth it in the end.
Now, the trail is complete from Butler to Freeport, Father Marinaro Park in Butler down to Freeport, and it's been in operation, or people are using it. It's everything that you envisioned it to be. Are there still some people along the route that complain about noise or people bothering them, anything like that, Ouch?
I'm sure there are some, but I haven't. It's not a big. Really not a big issue. As far as coming to our township meetings, no. But
I mean, there were issues. There's always issues with some kid was out on his dirt bike and he comes through someone's property and gets onto the trail or crosses it. And we've told people that if they have property on both sides of the trail, that if they have to take their farm equipment or their bicycles or quads or whatever across it, as long as you do it safely, there's not an issue. It's the renegades that come in with their dirt bikes or their quads and race up and down the trail. And the more use there is of the trail, the less that happens. And I haven't really heard of any of that happening recently.
Is there any policing going on to prevent that from happening? How do you stop them?
At one time, the Game Commission would help police it. But Chris and her crew police it. There's gates up now, if people, I mean,
It's well established. People know that it's a trail, and I mean, I've been on it, and I've seen someone come down on a dirt bike, and they see someone on the trail, and they just turn around and go back the other way. So
When
the more
people-
use it is, the more safe it is. Yeah.
When people recreate, when they vacation, when they go out and take a walk or take a bike ride or ski along the trail, people that go to these kind of places want refreshments, they want a snack, they want a drink. Do you have anything like that nearby?
Well, there's a bicycle shop and snack shop
In
up
Herman.
in Herman. The golf course in Summit Township, they have a little restaurant area, a snack area that they invite people from the trail to go up there. There's a walkway going up to that. But if you go up and down 356, and that's how I judge how much use the trail's getting, is by how many cars I see with bicycles in the back. And you go to the restaurants, you see them there. You go to the grocery store, there's 2 or 3 cars there with bicycles on the back. And more than likely, they're going down to the trail at some point, yeah.
Ouch, let's go back to 1988 when you first heard of this idea.
I wish I could.
And think about what you thought was going to happen, you thought the possibilities were, how you liked the idea, and you started to pursue the idea. Did you ever envision it would turn out to be what it is today?
Probably not. I mean, whenever we got in the 10 years or whatever, the lawsuits and the court, I don't know how many times I was in court. I think the first time I was ever in the court in Butler County, but I kind of knew my way around there pretty good. You'd go for hearing would last an hour or so, and nothing was ever solved. And they said, well, they didn't really want to solve it. They wanted to make people, discourage people. And they basically did. I think 2 of the other townships just kind of got not involved in it anymore because everybody, I guess they were told we were going to lose. And sometimes our board in Buffalo, at one time, there was 2 people against it. But I don't know. You heard more when people, a lot of people that you thought would be against it weren't against it. One time I mowed behind Lernerville Speedway when I worked there. I'd get down and mow from Sarver to Cabot, a couple times a month. And I'd stop if somebody was walking by. And the guy stopped that I thought he would be completely against the trail. I don't know why I thought that, but the kind of thought. And he stopped and he says, it was him and his wife. He said, he had a heart problem. And his doctor told him, go out to he lived in Buffalo Township, go to the trail and walk on the trail. It's level. He said, he said, we love it, and I thought, well, that's different. This was one that I thought was, would be the other way for, I don't know what reason I thought that, but he was completely for it. And you asked before about the money for legal fees. After this got started, because nobody had, the other townships hadn't showed interest in it, we wrote a letter to Butler County. And the lady there, I think her name was Cunningham, said they'd never really heard of it. It sounded like a really good idea and wished us luck. And then later, we requested we sent a letter requesting if we could have help, funding, and send a letter. It was in December of maybe 89 or 88, and in January, which is a really quick turnaround, we got a check from $40,000 from Butler County. And it was an environmental fine that had to be used for recreation. And so we did get help from the county, plus in where Osterling's is in Butler. Well, we owned that the whole way up through there. It actually went across the road. The trains used to go up across there. I think the gas company owns a building there now, and we owned right to I guess that's Monroe Street. And we sold property along there to Osterling's and I guess the auto body products, and because it wasn't part of where the trail ended. The trail has to have an end, a parking space, and it has to end. And we ended it in Father Marinero Park, so that was just kind of extra.
But the rail banking portion, it still had to go connect to another railroad.
Yeah.
It had to have a logical termination on that. So that still was maintained where it intersects with, I'm not sure which rail line it is up there. So the part that they sold was beyond that rail line, so we still maintained the rail banking status.
Ron, let's go back in your mind now. Looking back to the beginning, you were president of this council, the Butler Freeport Community Trail Council. Looking back over the years from the first time that you were involved with it and learned from Ouch that the township would be involved, and from the very beginning back in 1988, did you ever envision it to be the way it is today?
Yeah, I did. I just didn't think it would take so long. I thought it would, yeah, I'm proud of it, the fact that it turned out the way it did. It was, other than raising a family, it was one of the best things I've ever done.
Isn't it amazing to you? It is to me, just listening to you telling the story here today, that local citizens, volunteers mostly, and local governments at the lowest level of government, which is the township level, and then the county level, and then the state level, and then the federal level, it all seemed to come together and work. It seems like those things never happen.
Well, all I can say it was meant to be, I guess. That everything fell into place eventually.
If you could describe in a couple of sentences for those people who had no idea what the trail is or still don't, how would you describe what the Butler Freeport Trail is?
Yeah, it's just 21 miles of natural beauty. I mean, you start in Freeport and it's steep ravines, Buffalo Creek, which is a pretty active creek, very scenic. Then you go up through further up in Buffalo Township and you're still in a nice ravine with Little Buffalo Creek. And then you gradually go into farmland and pasture land as you work your way up towards Great Belt. Once you're in Great Belt, which is the highest point on the trail, then it starts downhill back towards Butler, and you're back into the little village of Herman, and then more woods, and then end up coming around the bend and across the bridge, and there's downtown Butler right in front of you. You can see the courthouse from the bridge. So, at the far end, you're started basically, steps away from the Allegheny River. So it's unique because a lot of trails are straight and flat, and it's either all farmland or all woodland. Here, it's always ever changing on our trail. It's different.
Fellas, thanks very much. Thanks for telling the story of the Butler Trail, Butler Freeport Trail, because it's an amazing story, an unbelievable story for those of us who see and hear about how difficult it is to get something done in this day and age. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's how it all came about. The saga of the Butler Freeport Community Trail began in 1988. It was imagined by just a handful of local residents who saw something that the people in the region would soon take to their hearts. What they imagined became a reality. Our thanks to Ron Bennett, longtime president of the Butler Freeport Trail, and Ouch Roenigk, the Buffalo Township supervisor, who joined us here today. They saw the potential and began the process of steering it through the many layers of government and the courts, and rallying the local residents along the way. So there you have it, the story of the Butler Freeport Community Trail.